Hello, this is Duncan Welder with RISC, and welcome back to another installment of xAPI in Action. We are exploring all things happening in xAPI and how it is developing as a standard, becoming more and more ingrained as a technology inside both classrooms and corporate training. Excited today to have the opportunity to chat with Andy Johnson. I've worked with Andy for a number of years now. Andy is with the ADL and oversees standards development. So excited to find out from Andy where xAPI is today, how it got to this point, and what are the possibilities for the future. So, with that, I'm going to bring Andy on, and if you would, Andy, introduce yourself, as I know you could do far better justice than I can. So, who are you? What do you do?
Hey, Duncan. Yeah, as Duncan said, I work for the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative. We're a Department of Defense organization that's federally funded under the Defense Human Resources activity. We used to be under Force Education and Training for a bit. We were under Personnel and Readiness for a bit, but our program's been moved around as our focus has changed. But for the most part, it's focused on distributed learning, as you could imagine with a name like Advanced Distributed Learning. I have chased this contract for most of my career. So I've actually had 3 different contracting companies I've worked for, but I've chased this program because I really believe in what we're trying to do, which is to essentially use technology to reduce the cost our government pays for getting training done and getting education across the services and government. So I really believe in that cause. It's really been a great place to work because it's been focused on the free exchange of ideas, information. They allow me to go into industry, into academia, and really anything I produce, I can give away, which is something I really like doing. I like that open collaborative nature. And, since the time I've been there, there's been this cool thing called open source. So it's been really great to work there. I've been there 21 years. So Duncan said I'm the specs and standards manager. That's kind of a self-created title. I've been a software engineer for a long time. I then pursued a degree for both my degrees at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I got a master's in education because I realized I need to understand the other side of this training and education thing. I can do the tech side, but I need to understand where all the academics are coming from and instructional designers. So I went ahead and did that. And then now I've just kind of been focusing more on writing technical standards that your instructional design team can understand. So mostly that's what I do. I do a lot of outreach facilitation, trying to bring people together. Thanks to Aaron Silvers, who got me into that. He really kind of pushed me out of my more introverted self. But that, and combined with Duncan knows I love karaoke. Those are some things that have pushed me out on the fringe of connecting people. So really happy to be here today to talk about xAPI. So Duncan, yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. No, it's great that you frame it that way, because I feel like the outreach, the community building. I wasn't involved in the development of the SCORM standard, so xAPI is really the first standard that I've had the opportunity to watch mature all the way through. And the thing that always gets me is the sense of community and sharing and wanting to make things better. Why standards, Andy? What drove you to think I want to make technical standards for now, with specifically in the learning space? But what was the driver there? What sparked your interest?
Well, I mean, really, as the engineer in me really wants to understand why things work and then oftentimes why things don't work. And oftentimes, especially in government, the reason things don't work are bureaucratic in nature. So there really should be a fundamental truth to why things work together, specifically code. Uh, there's really not a reason when you think about going back. You mentioned SCORM, the Shareable Content Object Reference Model. It didn't make a lot of sense that back in the early 2000s that there were systems that ran learning content and there were authoring tools that built it. So why could I not use the authoring tool content in one system and then bring it to another? It didn't make any sense to me, as an engineer, why that wouldn't work together. So now it's more or less coming down to, let's break down those barriers. Let's leave no reason why we can't work together. And so the technical solutions then are actually the easier ones. So in a way, I'm kind of punting the hard problem of bureaucracy and instead focusing on technical solutions of, how do we connect what are best practices in industry to other best practices in industry or best practices in academia or government. So yeah, why standards? Because it's easier to make ones and zeros work than people sometimes.
Oh no, that's brilliant, and I think you said it's ultimately ease of use in getting things to play nicely together, and that was. Y- I have been involved since the very early days of SCORM from a end user standpoint, not from a specifications or standards development side, but in those early days, someone would, come to me and say, "Is it going to work?" It's like, it should, but we need to make sure we test it because everyone interprets things a little bit differently, and that is smoothed out tremendously if we've got some time behind us and some advancements made there. But for the most part, now I'm not as concerned. I can have some confidence there. So I could definitely see the driver there. It's a interesting way of framing it away from instead of forcing people to work together in agreement. Let's build some standards so that our tools can do that. Specifically on the xAPI side or the Experience API project, what was the driver to cause ADL to initiate this project? What kind of gaps were they trying to fill there?
So you had mentioned SCORM again, and SCORM came out in late '90s, early 2000s, and it was a great standard for what it did, but it did introduce us to some vulnerabilities that we saw. There are some parts of it that were too complicated for your average person to implement, that authoring tools couldn't quite connect to. And in some ways, it went too far and it was too prescriptive and had some difficulties, but in some ways, it didn't go far enough in that people would expect that the data that went into SCORM would come out nicely in canned reports and that they could rely on that data and that experience of collecting data and showing it back to users, whether that user is a learner or an administrator or a teacher, providing that back to them consistently. And there was none of that. So myself, I fielded thousands of help desk tickets over a decade. Why doesn't this work? Why doesn't this work? And a lot of times the answer was, well, it's out of the scope of the standard. So, we decided we needed really a more modular approach to standards to figure out, okay, well, what should standards do and what shouldn't they do? How can we start to make consistent this entire ecosystem of behavior? And the first candidate up was, let's find something that can do SCORM like things, but opens the aperture up to really tracking anything, and it doesn't let the data get locked in. So those were really the two fundamental pieces of xAPIs. We wanted to track everything, and we need to make sure that people owned their data, that it didn't get locked behind specific programming methods that you could only retrieve in certain ways. We want to make sure we connected any type of end system to it, and that there was just great transparency in how that data would both be stored and be retrieved.
That certainly helps me understand. You look at SCORM itself as this massive document, giant standard, and then xAPI developed with more restraint around those things, and then being able to add things like profiles, what we'll talk about in a minute or two, really build on that basis. But the basis is small, defined, has some flexibility, of course. But then from there, we can take it in so many different directions.
Right, exactly.
So, how does this development process work, or how did it work with xAPI?
So there are two phases to this really, and the first was ADL acting, probably for the last time, as the standards developer. So for SCORM, ADL was essentially this developer that brought a lot of other existing standards together and started to put a little bit of its own flavor on it and made it into the SCORM standard. But for xAPI, we kind of put a different hat on, and we realized we're not starting with other standards. We're really starting with requirements. So we ended up contracting with an external vendor, Rusty Software, to run a lot of the foundational collaborative efforts that helped us figure out how to frame these use cases, to reach out to people, see what those pain points were. And they came up with a design that was simple and powerful, and flexible. And that was called Tin Can, and that was the foundation for what became later the xAPI. Once they delivered that, it seemed like a good idea. We decided to open it up to the entire community at that point. We started hosting working group meetings. There was no fee to participate. Anybody could show up, and I think some of our meetings we had 200, 300 people that were just really interested in this technology because, hey, this is going to be something that was going to improve on what SCORM could do. People were really excited about that. So we started just having meetings, a couple meetings a month, different types of meetings. Sometimes we'd focus on what does the data look like. Sometimes we'd focus on what would the system storage and retrieval look like. But over an amount of time, we had a bunch of meetings. We eventually moved the documents to GitHub to even further facilitate access and use. Even people who didn't collaborate in the meetings would send us pull requests to our standard and ask questions that really helped us iron out a really great standard. But at some point, we did realize that, wow, this thing has a lot of traction, but ADL is not a standards development organization. So we decided then to move it to one of the partnering organizations with ADL, IEEE standards group, specifically the LTSC, Learning Technology Standards Committee. And a lot of standards groups are great. We've worked with a lot of them over the years. A lot of them had foundational parts in SCORM, and a lot of them have foundational parts in other IEEE standards as well. But the IEEE was just a natural way for us to work together. We had some people in the LTSC that had already been working on a lot of other efforts. Avron Barr, for one, had already collaborated with ADL in a lot of different ways. So moving to IEEE just made a lot of sense for this standard. So I think it was in 2016 or 2017, we then moved it over to IEEE and started going through the process then of making it a standard. And that effort took a long time because IEEE is also emerging a new open source effort. And there was a lot of difficulty, I should say, because we had to go through a lot of different processes that people weren't as familiar with, just because ADL had been operating in such an open type of environment where there really were no rules. People could come and go, they could say what they wanted, and then usually we made decisions by consensus. And that was probably the most we had in terms of process. With IEEE, we had to move a lot of that into there. Then it's just ended up taking a while. And a lot of people were now at that point satisfied with where xAPI was. We had infiltrated the market. There were a lot of different systems available you could buy. Authoring tools were starting to pick it up. So there wasn't as much momentum once it hit the IEEE for people to stick around because honestly, there wasn't as much to do. So it ended up being stuck in a lot of processes with just a few people running it through. But that's how xAPI just last year became a standard under IEEE.
Yeah, but no, I think that's really valuable to understand, right? The fact that everything was very community driven, very open. But I feel like ADL is really that research group that helped define the requirements and creates the specification, and then that's been now handed off to the IEEE for taking a specification, defining it as a standard, but then also there's the ongoing maintenance of that standard that
Right.
will have to be
Yep, and
have
that's
to
one
be
of the
handled.
reasons, yeah, to use IEEE is that they're going to have that long-term maintenance. They're not going to, if the ADL program could not be funded at some point, it's a congressional will that it's funded. So it makes sense to move it to a standards development organization that, it has the longevity of, protecting things like Wi-Fi. If we don't think about Wi-Fi going away, part of that's because the standards development organization behind it is so strong. So we want xAPI to have a home. And then with the open source, it's great now because it's accessible and free for anyone online. If they just want to pull it up and see what it is, they can do that. And hopefully, my goal in the next year is to copy the model I've seen in CISO, which is a simulation group of the ISO standards. They build in an adoption working group that exists after the spec. So I'm trying to push the IEEE LTSC to create those working groups for all their open standards, is to just, hey, let's keep it going. Let's talk about adoption of xAPI. So the work that you guys are doing here, and thank you for doing this with RISC and having these interviews. so that this type of information can have a place to live. It's an open source repository, so anybody can contribute to it. It doesn't become part of the standard per se, but it certainly becomes part of community building, providing lessons learned and best practices, things like that that can keep the community engaged. So that's something I see as really important. As after a standard happens, the work's not done.
No, that's exactly right. This is like implementation of, software systems, especially at the enterprise level, right? Where you say, all right, you put all this time and effort and focus in setting things up and getting configured and working, and say, oh, wait, this has to have ongoing marketing even inside the organization, to keep it going. So that is interesting. Now, you mentioned that last year IEEE issued xAPI as a standard. I know there's a 2.0 version as well. What's the current, status, as a standard, and what does xAPI 2.0 provide, or what will it provide that we don't have now?
Yeah. So when we were the open source group at ADL, we did realize, and we were um, aware of the fact that the backwards compatibility really does matter. And so as we started making certain decisions, we realized we were at a threshold where there was a ton of adoption, but there were still some decisions that we needed to be sure of in terms of if we were going to make them or not, because we understood it would really cause a 2.0 version. It would end up potentially causing breaking behaviors in some of the learning record stores and some of the authoring tools that might be out there. So we were really cognizant of that at ADL. So we kept a running list of things that would have to change. And when it went to IEEE anyway, IEEE was going to take it under their own source control and issue it as a brand new version. So at that point, every system and every content authoring tool was already going to have to make some adjustments just to the fact it became an IEEE standard. So at that point, we decided, let's call this thing 2.0, effectively, and let's migrate all of those requirements that were really good ideas but might break existing implementations. We'll migrate all those over. Now, before we did that, we did end up putting out a survey to every single learning record store that the ADL knew about. So ADL, as a community facilitator, keeps an adoption registry where anybody can self-assert their compliance with xAPI. We also issued a test suite that allowed automation of that, and people could share those results. The companies could share those results so that the community could realize who's passing the tests and who's implementing the standards. We issue it out to that entire mailing list of people who've done that. Here are the changes we're looking at. How do you feel about them? And there was not a single negative response. Those who are involved in standards implementation usually understand that less variability there is in how the standards are implemented, the more that your individual contribution to that standard and saying I'm conforming to that standard is going to help your own product. They eliminated the gray area. If something could be interpreted two ways, we needed to eliminate that, make it so it's only interpretable one way. And yeah, to a T, every system and content authoring tool that replied to that call agreed. So when we talk about xAPI 2.0, the main changes that you'll see are consistencies in the data and in how systems handle it. There were a couple things that we tried to be less prescriptive in doing, things like assigning a timestamp. Now we require that the content that goes in requires a timestamp. We also require time normalization. We encountered a lot of different scenarios where we allowed the content authoring to provide one timestamp, one time zone, and then the LRS might be in another. We really wanted to eliminate that, so we changed all of that to UTC. It wasn't worth the little bit of flexibility you might gain in doing that. We saw so many other scenarios where somebody could actually pass a test before they answered any of the questions, and said, well, that doesn't make any sense. We can't have these time zone errors or those types of things getting in the way of what would be practical data. We also added the notion of context groups and context agents, which are useful if you wanted to do things like contextualize who a learner actually is within a specific role. So, for example, if you had two different football teams that were playing and you wanted to keep track of who was on which team, we might pick teams in between games. So it might be useful for me to understand I'm on Duncan's team one game, but I'm on his opponent the other. So being able to capture context information about a learner specific to that learning activity was really important. And those are probably the biggest changes, but for the most part, they brought stability and interoperability to existing data and to all future data that xAPI produces.
Oh, that's fantastic. No, I think having the, and having gone through the process, that advances adoption so far, to be able to come in and say, all right, these are the rules. We have an automated test to show that you conform. And then the next logical step, as you mentioned there, with xAPI 2.0, say, all right, now that we've got some miles into xAPI, we've seen different use cases, content providers, video groups, all the different profile activity there. You are going to have the opportunity to find some of those things, like you mentioned, the inconsistency with the time zones, and tighten those standards up. So I'm glad that that's underway. I know one of the things that the IEEE does and is doing with xAPI is have a series of working groups that focus in different areas. I know they have different number schemes there. What do those groups kind of look like now? What are their focus? I know there's at least four or potentially more there.
Right. So I guess I would kind of, when we thought about this ecosystem approach that I mentioned earlier, xAPI was the first in, and that's also the first done. So I mean, all those changes that you talk about 2.0, those are all done. Those are all implemented. There's a test suite available that have all those. So feel free to, the community can feel free to use that to test their learning record stores. But yeah, xAPI was just the first of a few different standards, because if you think about how learning occurs, xAPI can track learner performance, but we still need to understand the learning activities that are taking place. We need to understand, how do we model learner knowledge, skills, abilities, and then how do we connect that up to other types of I guess just learner profiles. Like if you think of all the things that you might see in a learner profile, there are a bunch of other things that are tangent, that go beyond just what are my knowledge, skills, abilities, and which content have I taken. There could be personal attributes, there could be preferences. There's a lot of different things that roll into it that also should be captured by standards. So if we think about how all these pieces go together, there ultimately needs to be a way that connects a learner to an experience, to their knowledge, to a credential, to a certificate, and really understanding what is the evidence of learning, and then what is the artifact of learning. So there are a lot of different IEEE standards that get us on that path. For example, there are an entire xAPI family of standards, which I won't get into that yet. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you think of xAPI as kind of this self-contained, this is what the learner's doing. Uh, we have competencies, and then model, what does the learner know, or what could the learner know. The way I think of competencies is kind of like Christmas lights. You have a string of them that you have, not necessarily one goes out, the rest go out, but that they're linked together by wires. And if you once you have a competency, that bulb is on, and over time that bulb might get dimmer. You might have to kind of give it a little more juice to light up. But it's kind of this notion of, these are all the things that are available, all the off lights, but then some of them are turned on once I have some knowledge, or I've gained a proficiency in a skill. We also then have the ways to model different activities, which is learning metadata terms standard at IEEE. There's a ton of metadata standards that have been out there, but we took a similar approach to SCORM and looked at, what are the problem cases, like what do people want metadata to do that it's not already doing. And we defined about 30 different terms there that help people really hit the use cases that we'd expect from metadata. How do I manage the life cycle? How do I discover, how do I distinguish between what's a learning object and what's a learning opportunity, or what we call a learning event? Because it's different if I'm attending a very specific instance of a course versus some, Army and Navy hands me a course that I can load on my learning management system. Those are very different use cases, but oftentimes we're stuck modeled in the same metadata. And then finally, we have what we call enterprise learner record standard, which kind of takes care of a lot of the rest. It models what would be a learner profile, and there's still some fluidity to what's going on in that group. One of the key connections I think is useful is trying to understand what would be a common way to saying, how do I populate a learner profile? So, if I wanted to say, put my height in a learner profile, I think there might be a common xAPI statement that we might use to do that. So trying to standardize how those learner profiles are built, because if you're thinking about interoperability, uh, if you do look across a series of products, learner profiles are very diverse and very different. And a foundational data model is useful, but understanding how that data model is populated, I think, goes one step further. And with the purpose of all these standards is not to make everything look the same, or even necessarily work the same, but to have some foundational components to them that then people, who are developing don't have to think about those mundane details. They can spend the product development cycles innovating, offering more to the end users rather than what we consider basic features or standard features. That's why we call them those types of things. So
That makes sense, and I think to have the context of the profiles or the use cases that are defined, ultimately helps us understand that data, allows us to use it across multiple systems without fear of confusion, because those things are defined. So the interoperability there is really high on the list. So excited to see what comes out there. And I guess speaking of what comes out there, what do you expect to see out of these various working groups over the next year or so? And can people still get involved?
yeah, there needs to be some work done there, because there's going to be we need to have some competency profiles. We need to understand how rubrics work. So one of the areas of competence that we talk about is, I talked about the Christmas lights, but what I didn't tell you is, well, how do I decide if my light is on or off? Those are rubrics, and there needs to be some stake that the competency owner holds in determining if that light is on or off. I can't just necessarily say, I have conquered the internet, I know everything, and expect that to be true and then propagate through other systems. That's just not going to happen. There needs to be some ownership, and those types of things need to still be modeled. So I'd say pay attention to the competencies group, especially the learning metadata terms working group. The draft standard's gone to is heading to ballot. It's finalized and voted on by the working group, but there's still a lot of work there defining schemas, best practices. So that group is open, and this is going to be really the first working group that uh, puts out a standard and then has stayed open. So the other two kind of put the standards out and then close, xAPI and shareable competency definitions. So this metadata group is going to be interesting with that. And then finally, the enterprise learner record. That one is still active, still get involved. There's a huge data model it has. It's kind of starting with a different type of approach of having a giant data model and then banging on it. So it's going to take a while, but that one, if you're interested in that, that one's still going strong and still has plenty of opportunity to influence what goes into there. And then there's plenty of xAPI profile working groups and the xAPI profile standard, which we'll get into that a little bit. I think you probably have some other questions you might have on those. So I'll just say that there are plenty of active ways to get involved. So you can feel free to send those requests through me. I'm the vice chair of the IEEE LTSC for the first year. So feel free to reach out to me in that capacity. I can connect you to any of those other working groups. And there's plenty of other working groups I'm not talking about that function in an ecosystem. So there are AI-based IEEE working groups. There are other types of learning technology working groups as well that I'm not necessarily bringing in because I'm thinking about this data holistically, but there are some that deal with equity, with very specific communities of practice that are all available at IEEE as well. So don't want to sell that short. I'm just kind of talking about the few that I know about and I'm connected to with the ADL initiative.
Yeah, I'd say this is one of those that I'd never, not being a standards development person, your use of the term, ecosystem there, I think is a really nice way of breaking it down and having these much more modular sections. And you're right, I think the enterprise learner record is one that to me has such variability because there can be so many things that are associated with that learner record where a lot of the profiles take a very narrow approach, right? Where say, what are the things that happen with video and I want to record those, or with testing, say with the CMI kind of work. So seeing how those are going to evolve is going to be interesting there. Since you've been close to it since the beginning, What have you seen that were unexpected benefits of xAPI as you've moved through this process?
Well, it's funny you say the word process because that's actually what I was just going to talk about. Is that I think when we started, we thought about xAPI in terms of how is it going to improve learner performance, but what we realized is that it really provides great feedback loops to not only fix, allow the opportunity to intervene, I should say fix, student performance, but also how is the content performing? And with that, how are processes performing? So we can start to understand with this data, we can collect the intricacies of how people actually perform. So we can think about, all right, if we now understand across learning activities who these high performing learners are, then why are there low performing content pieces? Why are high performing learners, you know, hitting low performing content? It might point to a problem in the content. It might point to a problem in the system. So the idea that we can now deploy these different learning activities in different ways across different systems, we have great insight into what the context is. So we can actually start to look at how do we improve content or process improvements. And I'd say the one even more expected is we started linking xAPI to physical tools as well. So as one experiment, we hooked it up to riflemen with rifles in marksmanship training, and you actually then started to see where do some of the mechanical failures come into play, or where do some other types of things that you wouldn't even think of. You're just thinking of what's in data. For marksmanship range, for example, we found that one of the targets was actually partially obscured by a tree that was affecting learner performance. So, like those are the types of things you just wouldn't expect to find. But when you start instrumenting things with xAPI and tracking that data granularly, you start to get insights into what is not optimal about the performance, and not necessarily blaming the learner, but like really tracing it back to where is uh, that non optimal behavior coming from.
Yeah, this reminds me of a conversation I was just having the other day with Megan Torrance on kind of their approach to data collection going through, and you say that about not in the past having good insight into what's useful, what is being used, what's not being used, how those things can correlate together, and it led to an interesting discussion on kind of the evolution of your data strategy, if you will, when creating something. You say it's very important up front to know that, and her example was a course where you could have text and audio, you could have just text and no audio, or you could just do a podcast kind of audio experience. And one, it's important to be able to compare that to success, right? So is someone more successful if they go through this, or in general, are students more successful? Do they score higher if they go through a audio and text version? Are they deficient if they go audio only? And the interesting thing that really jumped out is you had basically a third of people going through each format initially, and then the people that were going audio only really tailed off and stopped for the most part. So you can say now I have some kind of data when I go back in, or make a proposal, and an instructional designer says, we need to have a podcast that covers this material. And it's like, okay, but I now have documentation evidence that this usage tails off after a certain amount of time and hasn't proved as valuable there. So that use of xAPI for a deep understanding of how people are using content, I think deep content evaluation is important. But then it also shows that, at a base level, if you say, I've got a third of the people going through each of these different formats, and that stays consistent for a period of time, I may not need that data tracked anymore, right? Once I prove something out, it was valuable, especially going into the next project, to say, hey, do you want to use the data? Do you want to use the most efficient route based on, on this data coming through? But now our focus really is on, the student side more exclusively than usage of the applications, because that stuff has already proven itself out. So it's how those things will evolve. Um, all right. I know I am running close to the end of my time with you, Andy. Anything else that, again, you're looking at the crystal ball, or wanted to mention or plug that you see coming through?
Yeah, one of the big things that helps xAPI work, as you mentioned, are these profiles. So profiles, are usually founded in communities of practice that revolve around a specific use case. You brought up video, you brought up CMI5, which is basically a profile for how people have done courseware for the last 20 years. But we're working in the DoD to really kind of see what else we can do to push the envelope there. So um, there's going to be a lot of other opportunities, I think, for working groups that are going to be revolving around use cases. And in particular, as we start to standardize those we're going to use the IEEE because that's where we already have a lot of the xAPI foundation. We're going to be building out xAPI profiles. But first, we're going to define how those xAPI profiles actually look. There was a great deal of effort that went into a specification there, but now we're trying to standardize that approach as well. So not just saying, okay, well, what is an xAPI? What are the xAPI profiles? We need to understand, what does an xAPI profile look like? How is it structured in data? Because one thing we see is that the idea of implementing a standard in, say, an authoring tool or another product has been traditionally daunting. But if we can make it so that we can predict what the types of data could be, we can start to then make it easier for authoring tools to say, if you develop data profiles, I know that you're going to have to be bound by these constraints, and those constraints are going to be driven by a specific, let's just say, JSON or XML file. I don't need to know what your profile is before you tell me what it is. You can just load it, and then I can help you by saying, I can make sure that the data coming out of this application is now conformant to that profile you told me. So then again, with that, data predictability, comes a lot of interoperability success, a lot of ability to share data across different use cases and platforms, and to really see interesting correlative behaviors that you kind of touched on this. Some students were or were not successful based on the modality they chose. What does that expert versus novice behavior look like? What is a successful person doing versus an unsuccessful person? And can we then say, well, unsuccessful person, if you try this approach, see how successful you are. Maybe it's less about the person, it's more about the approach. And those are the types of things we can start to explore with xAPI and more use of xAPI profiles.
No, I agree with that completely. And I think one of the difficulties we've had, in the past, and saying this as a person that's worked in the LMS space for a number of years, is we really only tracked and paid attention to those big events, right? And doing curriculum development for engineers years ago, that was one of the things that you really had to seek out. You started out with, all right, I've got my star performers here. What are the things you do every day? What are the things you do every month? What are the things you do once a year? What are the things you hate to do? So you kind of build that task list out, and then and say, well, all right, this is something that you do. Where did you learn that? How did you get good at that? And there's some things that people are just more naturally skilled in, and have an ability that doesn't require specific training, or they've developed without ever thinking about it, because that's an interest in something that they do. But then there are also the things that happened outside of the LMS, outside of the classroom, where you said, all right, well, I pulled the same book off my shelf that was assigned to me in college 20 years later, and referred to it. And those are the things that you just never can capture without getting that direct feedback. Now, probably less applicable with a book, but if it's an ebook or some kind of online resource now, again, we can track that with xAPI and get a more holistic view of that person's, let's say, developmental activities, even if they're not what we think of as traditional training there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you could think about maybe somebody looks up a certain forum post each time, or maybe they use the same help guide. I mean, Heck, maybe the extra resources you actually put in with a course, somebody's reading them and they're clicking those links and learning more. And guess what? They actually are helpful. So maybe some people are benefiting from that. So it's good to understand, what are people doing both inside the course and outside the course. So xAPI and a combination of CMI5 enables that within a course, but then you could also have xAPI that's operating with any sort of hook. So any application that you have, if it has a coding based event, I would say you could create an xAPI statement that goes with it, and then understand more what that learner is doing, and hopefully then how they're successful.
All right. Andy, I know your time is valuable. I appreciate it so much. Andy Johnson, Advanced Distributed Learning with the Human Resources Group of the Department of Defense, right?
Yep.
Now, all right. Hey, thank you so much. I appreciate it and look forward to carrying on this conversation as we go through. So, thank you very much. Have a great remainder of your day. I appreciate all the time.
You too. Take care,
All
sir.
right.
Bye bye.
Cheers. All right. Thank you again for joining another episode of xAPI in Action. Want to thank Andy Johnson for coming in, sharing his insight in how the ADL and the IEEE work with the development of learning standards, plus how people like you and I can get involved in future standards. If you do have questions for me, don't ever hesitate to reach out. Later in the year, in November, we'll be out at the DevLearn conference from the eLearning Guild in Las Vegas. Also, if you have a project that you'd like to discuss on xAPI in action, just drop us a line and we will be glad to chat. Thank you, and keep an eye out for the next episode.